Y'all must be wondering why this guy's wearing a baseball cap on stage. So, flashback for the film buffs in the room to 1890s. A young fellow in Brooklyn, New York, asks a young woman out to a ball game. And they're riding on the trolley, I believe it was to Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, for you baseball fans out there, and trying to avoid the Dodgers, which is the origin of that name. We call them the Dodgers because these were the fans going to the ballpark dodging the trolley, hence the Dodgers. So this young fella is flirting with this woman, and she says, "Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. Let's go and root for the home team." Think about the association there between rooting, which is the verb that we did not invent as Americans for our obsession with sports. It goes all the way back to the Greeks. 2001 or 2003, I wrote a book on the history of the Olympics and found out that there were prayers, chants, and songs, poems about rooting for the Spartans, rooting for the Athenians, for the Corinthians when they went to Olympia in the quadrennial, the Olympics every 4 years. So this has become one of my metaphors for the desperate need for home. This is one way in a very rootless, we've already used that word a couple of times, a rootless world. How do we identify with our neighborhood, with our community, with the people around us? One way is to root, which means to sink deep into the soil, the identity, the story of where you are. I've been traveling since I left Detroit after I graduated. Didn't even go to my graduation ceremony because I've been forced by circumstances to work in a Detroit steel factory for the 4 years I was in college. So I needed to get out. It was the most violent city in the world in the early 70s. And because I was a writer and I adored Hemingway and Joyce, many of the writers that I grew up with, I had to go to the source. And this brings up the whole notion of the second home. I may have been actually born in the Deep South in an Army hospital in South Carolina. And then we went into the family stories in the 49 Hudson, just like Jack Kerouac when he went from New York to San Francisco, 49 Hudson. And we drove for 2 days to get up to Detroit. And that's then where I grew up. So one time I asked my mom, "Why do you think I've traveled so much, Mom?" She said, "Well, isn't it obvious, Philip? Isn't it obvious?" Just like mothers would do. She said, "It's because you were in the back seat of that 49 Hudson with the tires rumbling in your soul till we got all the way to Detroit. And you've been trying to reenact that all this time." I thought, that's a good mythology of any. And so as soon as I left Detroit, this whole idea of the spiritual home, the second home. Have you, in the audience, have you felt this? You go to Paris, you go to Athens, Scotland, Ireland, wherever it may be, and you suddenly mysteriously feel at home. Maybe even more at home there than you do in the physical home. And arguably, I've been trying to replicate that ever since. So I feel in some ways at home everywhere in the world, just a little more at home in some places. And because I grew up with the story of the Odyssey, some of you have heard this, but I was about 10 years old and the 6-foot tall Philco TV broke. And my father spent about a half an hour trying to fix it and got outraged. And he said, "Philip, follow me." And we is that the verb? Drug the TV through the living room, through the kitchen. And then my father kicked it down the stairs into the basement and turned around with his arms akimbo, that great old word, akimbo, and said, "We're going to read out loud together now as a family."
Wow.
And we did till I was about 16. Friday and Saturday nights, we read books out loud, the classics as a family. The 3 children, we all read a page. My mom and dad read a page. And that's how I learned, or I was introduced to Homer. We read the children's version of the Odyssey and the Iliad first, and then as we got older, the older and older versions of it. So the notion of Odysseus trying to get home again must have resonated with me. I never deeply identified with Detroit because it was so violent. Remember, there's this thing where we can romanticize home, but what if you live in a violent place? What if you live in a place where you are afraid, which is the opposite of sanctuary?
Yes.
Sanctuary is where you go for safety to get away from fear. And it's where you are also, it's a neutral zone because originally the sanctuary was where fugitives could go and not be harmed. Fugitives from war, fugitives from local jailers, whatever it might be. So I learned this sense of sanctuary because Detroit and the factory I worked in was so violent.